Well, welcome back, everybody. This is going to be covering Chapter 4 from the American Yop, Colonial Society. So let's go ahead and get started. As usual, I'll skip past these key point slides, but I do want you to look at them. They're in the PDF version of these slides that you have in Moodle, so they are good when you're thinking about taking the quiz. Maybe review these key points before you start, and I think you'll be a little bit better prepared. So let's start with this first major section on the consumer revolution. So consumerism as an idea has been around for a long time. It's a big element near the end of the Roman Empire as well. But consumerism is really just referencing an economy that has developed to the point where they're producing manufactured goods and you have an economic base of people within your society that use whatever currency that you're using at the time to buy those products, and by buying those products kind of give themselves a certain social status. So similar to today, the ability to afford certain goods imbued a person with a certain status. Back then, today, the same thing. We have those jokes today about like not texting people that have the green bubbles instead of the blue bubbles. That's kind of an element of our modern day consumerism, how we associate certain goods with higher status and we think better of people that own and have certain things like that. So this is an element that's creeping in to the British colonies in North America in the early part of the 18th century, um, top to bottom, but where you see it the most pronounced are in like the merchant classes of New England, and then also these planter classes in Virginia in particular, where you have certain individuals, certain families that own massive amounts of land, massive amounts of slaves, and they're really kind of the economic powerhouses of the area, and they're setting themselves up in a way that they're trying to separate themselves from the lower classes. They've been doing that for a while, even after Bacon's Rebellion, when they saw that poor whites and freed blacks can come together on an issue like that. They've been trying to separate themselves into that upper crust elite for a long time. So in Virginia, you have coming out sort of this neo aristocracy in America, where certain families are considered the upper crust, the better part of society. Like there's a hereditary nobility in England. There wasn't one in the United States per se, but there was based off economics. There is that upper elite that do control a lot of the power. And as we keep going along on this journey towards the American Revolution, they're going to be big players in this, and we'll talk a little bit about why that's so, maybe why they supported a revolution. But just as an image example you have on this slide, cool item still at Mount Vernon today. That's George Washington's silver wine cooler set. George Washington's going to be part of that upper crust Virginia elite, and he uses his purchases to reinforce that he is elite, that he does have more money, and hence more power. And so an example there is pewter versus silver serving sets. We'll look at that on the next slide real quick. Here you have an example of just a pewter plate. So pewter isn't something that we use anymore. It's an alloy of like lead and tin. So it's very cheap. And in a lot of British North American homes at the time, you're going to find items of pewter, like this plate and other things. And even that's kind of a sign of the middle class. You still have a lot of families living more on the edges of the European colonies that are still using wooden utensils and all of that. But still, for for the purposes of this pewter plate kind of represents a poor or at least a normal person. And this silver serving platter that you have here is kind of indicative of something that a higher class person might have in their home. So using items, we use phones and laptops and TVs and gaming consoles and all of that as part of our modern day consumerism. But household goods like this were quite a way to show your wealth in the time. But to go along with this rise in consumerism, the Americas are starting to have a major money problem. So early America lacked hard money. And what I mean by that is that in this period, money was a physical object, almost always, and like a physically minted coin. We don't really use our change much today, but our change is also made of not worthless, but low worth metals, and the value of them is just something that we've given them. They're backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, right? But in this period, you're using precious metals as money because those have inherent value. There's only so much gold and so much silver in the world, so that limitation gives it value. And there is just not much of that going around in early America. And that is a problem when you don't have this commonly agreed upon thing that holds consistent value across the board. It's a problem. A lot of these early colonists, excuse me, were still living in a life and society where bartering was a major component of their life. So, say I grow wheat. You need wheat to make bread. My neighbor grows potatoes, and I want some of those potatoes. I give him some of my wheat. He gives me some of my potatoes back. But as far as coin money that you can hold in your hand and hold a consistent value anywhere you spend it, there's not enough of that going around. So different colonies have different ways of addressing this. In Massachusetts, they become the first place in the Western world that issues paper bills in 1690. So these bills are kind of similar to what we do today with our cash, but our cash is backed by the U.S. government. That's how we know it has value. We know that the United States government will back that value up. But these bills are more they're issued by select banks, different organizations, not always just the state, but they are supposed to be backed by an equivalent amount of real precious metals, gold or silver, whatever it is. This paper money was just an easy way to exchange between people who couldn't get access to a lot of those physical metals. But once you had those notes, those paper bills, you were supposed to be able to go to the bank, turn that bill in, and they would give you the equivalent amount of gold or silver. That's how it was supposed to work. Virginia, they lean harder into this bartering system to address the problem. So they try to regulate the rate of exchange for tobacco. So in a sense, they're trying to use tobacco as a currency. They're trying to come to an agreement on like what a certain weight of tobacco is worth. And then that way, people within Virginia, a very tobacco heavy economy anyway, could exchange tobacco leaves, kind of similar to how we use cash today. So that is very interesting there. Here you just have an example of both of those. Here on the left you have one of those paper currency notes from Massachusetts and then some dried tobacco leaves from Virginia. And just kind of an example of what I'm talking about in terms of hard coins. I'll also use the phrase specie. Specie is referring to coinage like this. This one is minted in Spain. I include it because since there was not a regulated currency in British North America, they used coins from all different countries. So they could use a Spanish coin because they knew that this Spanish coin was a certain weight of silver that had a certain amount of value. You could use that to exchange goods. So the nationality of the coinage doesn't make as much of a difference back then. They're more concerned with the value of the material that the currency is made out of. Here's another Spanish example that you've got here. Now, obviously, Great Britain does mint a lot of their own coins. The main problem is just not enough of those are getting over to British North America and circulating among people. So that's really the problem. It's not that the British didn't mint coins, it's just that there weren't enough of them in America. And here, if I had you guys in class in person, I have a few of these lying around. So I usually take one of these out and pass it around the class. You can kind of feel this. This is an example of a Dutch currency, but even this isn't issued directly by the Dutch government at the time. This is issued by the Dutch East India Company, who issues their own coinage. That's not an not an unheard of thing in the period, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. There are British companies that will mint their own coinage as well. So it's not nearly as regulated as we think of today. We wouldn't use any coins not minted by the United States government, right? But in this period, it really is more about the physical value of the item than it being backed by the full faith and credit of the government. And so Benjamin Franklin makes this statement because the currency problem is a well-known one. People are talking about it. Benjamin Franklin, he said, and since a plentiful currency will be so great a cause of advancing this province in trade and riches, and increasing the number of its people, which, though it will not sensibly lessen the inhabitant of Great Britain, will occasion a much greater vent in demand for their commodities here. And allowing that the crown is the more powerful for its subjects increasing in wealth and number, I cannot think it is the interest of England to oppose us in making as great a sum of paper money here as we, who are the best judges of our own necessities, find convenient. So while he said that in 1729, he is really alluding to this movement in the British government of trying to restrict money, regulate it more heavily in its overseas colonies, and those come to fruition with these two currency acts. So the first one, 1751, it restricted the paper money that could be printed by banks in New England. They were the first ones to do it. And then in 1764, they extended those restrictions throughout all of the American colonies. So it didn't outlaw paper money per se, but it did prevent one thing that was going on at the time, which by modern economic theory we think is crazy. You wouldn't do it. But some of the colonies were printing more money whenever they came up for a payment of debt. And there is a lot of debt in the American colonies that's owed back to merchant houses and businesses in Great Britain. So Great Britain is trying to make it to where the American colonies can't just print more money to pay off those debts. You print more money, it devalues the money, and the debts paid are worth less than what they really are. So the creditors back in Great Britain feel like they're getting gypped by that. So they implement that act in 1764. That's part of a larger package of bills that we'll talk a bit more about in the American Revolution section, but a very much not popular bill in the North American colonies. All of this, the consumerism, the currency crisis, this leads to the rise of credit. Credit's not a new thing, even though credit cards are. It's been around for quite a long time as an economic concept. But these British merchants had been offering credit on raw materials from America. So a lot of families started purchasing outside of their means. And what I mean by that is take Virginia, for example. You trade with a British company for the tobacco that you have. You give them the tobacco. What that British company does, instead of giving you straight money for the tobacco, they give you credit. Um, and this becomes a kind of a thorn in the side of Americans, that they're getting credit, not money. So it's not helping the currency problem. They're not putting more money into circulation. What they're really doing is just growing their debt more and more to these British merchant houses who kind of have a monopoly over them. They're not giving them money, they're giving them credit. You can only use that credit within that specific British merchant house. So it was a reasonable complaint that these elite Americans had on the eve of the American Revolution that British companies were kind of sleazily ensnaring them in huge amounts of debts that were only payable to them. They were stuck within the certain bounds of the specific British company. So a reasonable complaint, actually. Here's a little excerpt from the Boston Evening Post, a newspaper in Boston, and it says, "For 'tis well known how credit is a mighty inducement with many people to purchase this and the other thing, which they may well enough do without." So, advice that you would hear today about credit cards, right? You don't need to buy that. You're only doing it because you feel like you have the ability to with credit card. It's like the money doesn't exist. Well, the debts always come due. And so this is just kind of like a social commentary of the time about how these merchant and elite families are using credit to purchase outside of what they can actually afford. So all of this leads up to around the time of the American Revolution. American merchants and planters, they owe somewhere around £5 million, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that is equivalent to over £500 million today. And they owe all of that back to British creditors. And just as a spoiler, the Treaty of Paris that ends the American Revolution, one of the big things that took a lot of negotiating time between the two sides to come to terms on was how they were going to handle the debt from before the war. And the British really made it a requirement in their negotiations to have the Americans accept that they would still pay off the debts that they had to British merchants, even though they had won independence. That's a big part of those negotiations. All right, so we're going to take a second now and we're going to talk about different forms of slavery in colonial America. We've talked about the origins of slavery, but here we're really going to go on kind of a regional basis and talk about how slavery looked in different parts of colonial North America. The first one we're going to look at is Virginia slavery. It's usually maybe the state that we associate with the most with slavery. These large tobacco plantations, George Washington, a lot of our big early founding figures are from Virginia, so we're a little bit more aware of it. But in Virginia, how I was mentioning they're building this sort of neo aristocracy, they do that also partially through a system called primogeniture. So that's an old um, legal element of inheritance, but it just means that the eldest son usually inherits the vast majority of everything. So instead of having 10 kids and when you die, your entire estate gets split up evenly between all of them, your eldest son gets the majority of it, and then you give a little bit to all your other kids. And what that does is it keeps huge amounts of land within the same family. So it's not just a one generation and then this huge plantation system gets split up amongst different kids. These go on for generations. Your great 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 grandfather might have started this farm. By the time it gets to you, if you're the eldest son of the eldest son of the eldest son, then your family's accumulated a lot of land, a lot of slaves, and a lot of wealth, and it builds up that elite structure in Virginia that's pretty unique to that state, but you can kind of see it in a lot of the other southern colonies as well. But that is an element of making these huge plantations, and the huge plantations they helped build this economy that's built around tobacco, and tobacco is a very labor intensive crop. It takes a lot of work. It's very finicky. It's um, very sensitive to elements and whatnot. And so, because of this, the Virginia planters they utilize a gang system of labor, to where the enslaved people on these plantations would work from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, sunrise to sunset, in very large groups or gangs, and they would work with supervision from an overseer, or they might call them a driver. So that is probably the type of slavery that is most prevalent in the kind of the American cultural mind today would probably look a little bit more like this Virginia system. And every aspect of their life is very carefully supervised and regulated. And you have these white overseers that hold complete life and death power over these groups of enslaved peoples. And part of this really strict system of slavery in Virginia are the Virginia slave codes we've talked about in a previous lecture. In 1705, they passed an act concerning servants and slaves. And the slaves in Virginia had a lot of restrictions on them. They could not be freed unless the freed slaves were sent out of the colony. That is a direct reference to Bacon's Rebellion, when free blacks joined with poor whites in a revolt against the power of the elite in the colony. And so they didn't want any free blacks in Virginia at all. So you had to leave the colony or you could be re-enslaved. An enslaver couldn't be tried for murdering a slave, so they did not have civil rights, legal rights, really whatsoever. A slave striking a white colonist would be whipped, if not worse. And white colonists, under no circumstances, could be employed by a black colonist or even a free one. And that's reinforcing the social, racial structure of all whites, even the poorest of the whites, are better than any black in any circumstance. Now going to the Carolinas here. The Carolina economy is centered heavily around rice, not tobacco. And because of that, the Carolinian enslavers, they are wanting to import slaves from very specific regions of West Africa where rice growing is the most common. And so they do that. And Carolina has a climate that's similar in many ways to big parts of West Africa. So there are a lot of tropical diseases, it's kind of a swampy area. And so a lot of the landowners, these white landowners, they owned huge tracts of land that were granted to them by the king. They weren't actually living there. They were kind of absentee landowners. So they owned this land. They received profit from working the land, but they didn't necessarily live in Carolina. But a lot of the slaves that were imported from these regions of West Africa, they were immune to these tropical diseases. They were childhood diseases to them. And in Carolina, you're going to see a task system rather than a gang system. And that gives the enslaved people a little bit more autonomy in their life, a little bit more of a say in what they do. So they had daily tasks, and once those were complete, the enslaved could, within reason, do what they wanted. And that led to them growing a lot of their own crops. So it leads to a slave culture in the Carolinas that retains a lot more of their native traditions from wherever they were from in Africa. The gang system didn't really allow any time for that, and especially didn't allow them to grow any of their own food. Carolina slaves, they had that. So there is a much different slave culture in the Carolinas and other parts of the Deep South than you see in Virginia. And let's not forget about the Mid-Atlantic. There was still slavery there in this period. So the agriculture in the Mid-Atlantic, I think Pennsylvania, New York, or New Jersey, that area, it didn't really support large plantations. The soil wasn't very good, so you weren't going to have tens of thousands of acres being farmed by the same people, really. But on smaller family farms and in the cities, there's still a lot of enslaved people. Around 40% of New York City's population was enslaved in 1700, and about 15 to 20% of Pennsylvania's entire population by that mid-century mark in 1750. So on this road that eventually gets us to the American Revolution, we're going to look at a few things about American culture that are starting to split off from British culture. So when most of these white English colonists came to North America, they just considered themselves English and then later British. Um, but as time goes on, they've been separated from their home country for a long time. Things change and a different culture is going to start to arise. So one thing that's a bit different is just the concept of male suffrage. So suffrage is a word for voting rights. You might have heard about female suffrage and women's suffrage in the late part of the 1800s, early part of the 1900s. But in this period, in the 18th century, Great Britain and the Dutch Republic are the only European nations that even have regular elections. But the amount of people that were eligible to vote was pretty small. So in this period, only men could vote. That's pretty much a thing across the board. But in England and in Great Britain, there were property requirements as well. You could only vote if you owned a certain amount of property or you had a certain amount of money. So it was really a small select group of already kind of elite men that actually got to participate in these early British elections. But in the American colonies, because they kind of had that opportunity to set up their own autonomous governments without a ton of oversight from the British government, there's a lot more suffrage for men, white males, obviously, but a lot more than in Europe. The comparison is pretty stark there. And because everything is kind of being built from scratch in that sense, local government plays a much bigger role. So you, especially in New England, you see more instances of direct democracy where you had a small enough village or city or town where it was actually feasible for every eligible voting male to come together in one place and vote on every issue. So that's a direct democracy you see in New England a bit more. We don't function that way anymore, obviously, but uh, because of that, there's just much more of a tie-in for white men who perceive of this right to vote as an inherent right, not something that can be granted by the government. That's going to be a big issue coming up. So an example of the beginning of that is the Mayflower Compact. You had the 41 men on the Mayflower that signed an agreement to elect their own officials and to bind themselves to following a common law. And so that document the first time in the Western world where a group of individuals they agreed to a consensual government between themselves rather than just loyalty to a monarch, to some type of royalty. So that is a really important part of the history of politics in the West, is this Mayflower Compact. They agreed without any given leader at the time that they were going to set laws and everyone was going to follow them. So a really neat look at the beginning of a form of government. Here's another interesting kind of thing from this period. Just the idea of the companionate ideal, that marriage meant something more than allying yourself with a more powerful family. Like there's a deep emotional meaning to it. So when you actually read sources from this period, people are pretty emotionally open actually about how they feel about people and marrying for love and all of that. We kind of think of these as older, stodgy people, but when you read their correspondence, yes, it's in language that's a little bit different than us, but um, they were more willing to share their emotions than I think you might perceive of from this area. Here's an example of John Adams writing to his wife Abigail Adams, and he always called her Diana as a little pet name that he had for her. Diana's the Roman goddess of beauty, so that's sweet. And he writes that love sweetens life, and life sometimes destroys love. Beauty is desirable and deformity detestable. Therefore, beauty is not deformity, nor deformity beauty. Hope springs eternal in the human breast. I hope to be happier next fall than I am at present, and this hope makes me happier now than I could be without it. I am at Braintree, but I wish I was at Weymouth. What strange revolutions take place in our breasts, and what curious vicissitudes in every part of human life. This summer I shall like Weymouth better than Braintree, but something prompts me to believe I shall like Braintree next winter better than Weymouth. So you might need a little bit of explanation from that. She lived in Weymouth. He was from Braintree, so he would love to be in Weymouth with her. But after the fall, they're going to be married finally, and she's going to come to live with him in Braintree. This is an even more stark example of John Adams, a guy who, from the portraits, you don't really think of as a romantic, but he wrote this to her as well at one point. I hereby order you to give as many kisses and as many hours of your company after 9 o'clock as he shall please to demand, and charge them to my account. I have good right to draw upon you for the kisses I have given, 2 or 3 million at least. Print culture is another big part of the divergence of American culture here. The first printing press comes to Massachusetts in 1638, so been around pretty close to the beginning there. About 2 years later, in 1640, the first book printed in America is called the Bay Psalm Book. So that does say something about the religious priorities at the time as well, especially Massachusetts and the New England area. But by 1775, there are 37 weekly newspapers throughout the colonies. And why that's important is because it points to a population that can read. You have this population of immigrants from Great Britain who are not all necessarily part of the elite, but there's a huge amount of literacy in North America, especially compared to Great Britain. So about 70% of the male population, more than 70% probably, was literate in North America. And for the time period, that is a very, very high rate. There are some estimates, maybe somewhere between 50 to 60% in Britain, and that might be generous. So the ability to read gives you the ability to read a lot of different ideas from a lot of people. And so there's a lot of almanacs and sermons and proclamations and broadsides. So this ability to read and the ability to reach a large amount of people quickly with the written word, that plays a role in the American Revolution, absolutely. You have people who can print their revolutionary ideas and maybe their opinions that we need a break off from Great Britain. That can reach a lot of people because a lot of people can read. So that is a big, big deal. Let's talk for a minute about the First Great Awakening. So, that phrase refers to this religious revivalism, this surge in piety that you see between 1730 and 1770. It happens in America, but it also happens across the Atlantic in England, Scotland, and Germany. But we don't really know where it started, kind of unclear. And instead of it being this well defined, unified movement, it's really a cultural shift of some kind that occurs at kind of roughly the same time in a bunch of geographic areas. So, this revival is really focused on the individual's relationship with God. So, it's a bit of a change from the way that most European Christians had perceived their relationship with God and with religion beforehand. So, it kind of rests on this idea that you can do good works, you can profess your faith, and you can improve your relationship with God. You don't need the intermediary of a priest. You don't need to buy, um, excuse me, sorry, you don't need to buy forgiveness for your sins from the Catholic Church. You can talk to God individually and have a relationship with Him separate from your church attendance or your preacher or the denomination that you belong to necessarily. And this comes into direct competition with some older Calvinist ideas about predestination. That's a little bit too much to get into in the time that we have. But it's a revival of your personal relationship with God in some way. So there are a lot of very emotionally charged sermons and people recommitting their lives. Spoiler: there's going to be a second Great Awakening about a century after this, and then you can argue that there are more throughout American history as well. Jonathan Edwards is one of the big players of this area. He's a very important religious figure in New England. He's a little bit more of the older school. He emphasizes the wrath of God and the grace that he shows by not just casting all of us into hell. In high school, you might have read something called "A Sinner's in the Hands of an Angry God." It's the most famous sermon that he ever gave. It's kind of considered to be one of the catalysts of the First Great Awakening, but not in the sense that he gave the sermon and it started immediately. But it is still a very influential document. If you get a chance, I would go read it. Here are just some of the bullet points here that we'll skip this for the sake of time, but you can go back to the PDF and look at these in a bit more detail. George Whitefield. I know it looks like Whitefield, but it is pronounced Whitefield. He's an Anglican cleric. He's originally from Great Britain. And along with John Wesley, he's kind of considered one of the founders of Methodism. And one thing about him to take away, he if you know who Billy Graham is in the more recent time, he's kind of like an 18th century Billy Graham. He drew huge crowds. People loved listening to him talk. He was an incredibly good speaker, incredibly charismatic. He was kind of really one of the first rock stars in American history. In 1740, he started a horseback tour of all the American colonies. He wanted to go all the way up and down the eastern seaboard. And his sermons were printed, part of that printing culture and that male literacy that was very important. And there are some estimates that like nearly half of the colonial population heard him speak or read his sermons in some way. So everyone knows who the guy is, and he is pushing that idea of do good works and be public in your faith. Profess your belief in God and Christ as your Savior, and have a personal relationship with God. You can work towards salvation. Another thing about him is that he, quote, freely offered the gospel. So he believed anyone should have access to this. It wasn't a religion of white people, of black people. Everyone has access to the gospel message. So he does become a controversial figure because of that. He includes slaves in his gospel offerings, and he is very influential in spreading Christianity amongst enslaved African Americans. And this gained him some enemies in a lot of the South where there were huge populations of enslaved people. And here's kind of the crux of Whitfield's entire message. He said, "And now let me address all of you, high, low, rich, and poor, one with another, to accept of mercy and grace while it is offered to you. Now is the accepted time. Now is the day of salvation. And will you not accept it now it is offered to you? If your souls were not immortal, and you in danger of losing them, I would not thus speak unto you. But the love of your souls constrains me to speak. Methinks this would constrain me to speak unto you forever. What? Get to heaven on your own strength? Well, you might as well try to climb to the moon on a rope of sand." The 7 Years' War. In high school, there's a high probability that you heard this referred to as the French and Indian War more than the 7 Years' War. It's really a pedantic issue. They both refer to the same conflict, But if you want to get technical, the French and Indian War refers to the parts of the conflict fought in North America, and the 7 Years' War refers to a much larger global war between Great Britain, France, and a bunch of different allies that are all going on. So here in North America, these are the major sides that get split up. The French and the British, they're going to be the main combatants here, but they both have Native American allies. You can see the list there for the French and the list for the British. So the war starts, like many wars start, over a disagreement on a boundary between nations. And the French and the British, they disagreed on the boundary in the Ohio River Valley. So that's the section that's highlighted there. And George Washington, a very young George Washington, is sent to negotiate with the French by the Virginia governor. And so he goes and he delivers this message that the Virginians, and thus the British, require the French to leave. They don't belong there. This is British land. So the French refuse, and Washington is instructed to build his own fort at the Forks of the Ohio, which is around where Pittsburgh is today. After these failed negotiations, the French are continuing to build forts in the area that the British say is theirs. Washington is again sent to negotiate, and this time he ends up ambushing this small French force under a man named Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. And he is claiming that the French are encroaching into British territory, so he ambushes the French in this small little glen, kind of like a little valley. He kills 10 of them and captures 21 of them. Now, the French are going to then say that that group was on a diplomatic mission, is on its way to negotiate with the British, and that Washington pretty much jumped the gun and murdered them. The arguments fly back and forth between the British and the French about who is to blame. But what is interesting about this is that George Washington becomes a major world figure after this because his actions here kick off this long 7 Year war between Britain and France. That's kind of like the first World War. Sides are taken, major European powers are fighting on either side, and it's all because of the actions of this Virginian guy who's in his late 20s. He'll go on to be the most famous American of all time, but he didn't just pop out of nowhere in the American Revolution. He was a player going all the way back. This is the site of the ambush that is there that you can go visit. And George Washington actually published the journal that he was keeping at the time because he came under a lot of fire as the guy who started this giant war. So he published this as sort of not an excuse, but as a way to justify his actions per se. So this was a popular read. A lot of people read about George Washington and his take on what had happened and his view of things. So Washington got a lot of his early military experience during this conflict. At one point he said, "I can with truth assure you, I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound." So it sounds a little psychotic to us today, but remember that this is a period where the male conception of honor is quite a bit different than ours is today. So gaining honor and fame and glory through military actions was a big part of the period for men. So George Washington, product of his time, product of his social class as well. So after this ambush, he retreats and he builds this fort. They're going to call it Fort Necessity, and he's waiting for more British forces to arrive. But before they can, his fort and his small amount of men are surrounded by 600 French soldiers and some of their native allies, and they're led by the man who is the brother of the major French diplomat that Washington had killed. And it's an untenable situation. He doesn't have enough men to defend himself. He's not situated his fort in a very good place. It's one of these early learning periods for Washington where he's making a lot of mistakes. And he surrenders to the French on July 3rd, 1754. And he has to sign a capitulation agreement. So it's like a surrender agreement. But the French write it in French. Washington doesn't read French, so he doesn't really know what he is signing. And he signs this capitulation agreement that they snuck in a clause where he was admitting guilt, kind of. He was admitting that Jumonville had been assassinated, not killed in some legal, defensible military action. So he doesn't know what he's signing, and that kind of gets him into trouble. That's part of why he's going to publish his journal as an explanation of his action. The war from there, it escalates rather quickly. The next year, in 1755, a British general named Edward Braddock is sent to North America. He's sent there to kick the French out of the Ohio River Valley, but he is killed. His whole campaign's a massive failure. He's killed at the Battle of the Monongahela. There's a representation of his death. This is an explanation from George Washington, one of his journals, about the British facing off against the French and their native allies and how they were so ill prepared for the way that the French were fighting. He said, in short, the dastardly behavior of those they call regulars exposed all others that they were inclined to do their duty to almost certain death. And at last, in despite of all the efforts of the officers to the contrary, they broke, and run as sheep pursued by dogs, and it was impossible to rally them. The general, Braddock, was wounded, of which he died 3 days after. I luckily escaped without a wound, though I had 4 bullets through my coat, and 2 horses shot under me. But by 1758, the Ohio River Valley had been taken by the British, and then, even though that was really what the war had started over, don't let a good crisis go to waste, right? So the British extend their war goals, and they end up capturing Quebec in 1759 and Montreal in 1760, some of the major cities of the French colonies in North America. And when the war does end, France has to cede everything east of the Mississippi to Great Britain. So in this one moment, they win the war in the end. They massively increase the amount of British territory in North America. All that you see blue here um, became British after the war ended in 1763. A lot of historians like to refer to the 7 Years' War as the First World War. I've already kind of mentioned that, and in a lot of ways I agree, because look at this. They have several different theaters of the war. There's fighting that's happening in Europe, in Asia, in India, North America, and in Latin America. So the war started here in North America, but it spread quite quickly. And then major powers that got involved were Great Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Spain, Russia, Sweden. So in a lot of ways, that's a pretty good way to describe it is the First World War. Major powers all got involved because of very complicated alliance situations, and some countries just wanted a chance to knock France while they were down. The British won in 1763. They took those huge chunks of territory, and also because of this was in some ways the moment that the British Empire is really born. Before that, they had their North American colonies on the East Coast, but they gained so much territory in North America and Canada, but also in India and other places around the world, that this was really, to me, I would consider this the birth of the British Empire. Just another map kind of showing you the gains in land that the British had. So after that war is over, we're going to go into a Native American conflict now called Pontiac's War. So this all starts with a Lenape man named Naolin. He is considered a prophet, and he preaches this doctrine of shunning all European culture and pushing the Europeans into the sea. Like, we all come together and we defeat the Europeans and get rid of them forever. And they build a very loose coalition of Native Americans who believe in this message of getting rid of the Europeans, and they start to follow an Ottawa war chief by the name of Pontiac. So it's 1763, the 7 Years' War is ending. Pontiac lays siege to Fort Detroit, and other ones lay siege to Fort Pitt. It's a coordinated native attack. They've gotten together. They're organized. They know what they're doing, and they have this coordinated attack on various British settlements. And it's going to freak out the British colonists quite a bit. Here's a list of some of the native tribes that were involved. You can take a look at that. And here's a map where you can see where various battles like this happened between native groups and British colonists. So around 3 years, there's violence along all the frontiers, and they do capture a lot of the British settlements like Sandusky and St. Joseph, Miami. So they do have a certain amount of success. One element of the war that happens here to bring up uh, a situation involving the Paxton boys. So these attacks lead to an even larger increase in kind of prejudicial, racist attitudes towards Native Americans. And in Paxton, Pennsylvania, a mob of white settlers, they attack this group of Conestoga, killing 6 of them. Conestoga had nothing to do with the violence on the frontier. They just saw a group of Native Americans and they were enacted violence on them as some type of act of revenge. And Governor Penn of Pennsylvania, he puts the remaining Conestoga from that area into protective custody to protect them from the violence of these white settlers. But the mob, they broke into the building where they were holding them and they killed them too. So it was a major incident of indiscriminate violence against Native Americans simply because of their race and the color of their skin. Benjamin Franklin was aware of all that was going on there, and he called them barbarous men who committed this atrocious act in defiance of government, of all laws, human and divine, and to the eternal disgrace of the country and color. The wickedness cannot be covered. The guilt will lie on the whole land till justice is done on the murderers. The blood of the innocent will cry to heaven for vengeance. For our purposes in American history, probably the greatest single thing, greatest consequence of the 7 Years' War is what it does to the British debt situation. The British, they incurred massive amounts of debts fighting the war. The national debt before was around 74 million, and then by the end, around 133 million pounds. So almost doubling the national debt over the course of this war. And as part of their efforts to try to recover from all of that spending, the British start introducing taxes on the North American colonies that weren't there before, and that's going to be one of the major catalysts of the American Revolution. And with Pontiac's War, there are some consequences to that too. Because of that frontier violence, Great Britain passes the Royal Proclamation Act of 1763, and that restricts all white settlers from going past the Appalachian Mountains. So it sets a limit on how far they can go. And for a very land hungry group of British settlers, this does not sit well with them. That a government so many thousands of miles away is limiting what they can do on the ground. That does not sit well. That's going to be another more minor uh, grievance that the Americans are going to have with the British, but it does stick around. It's mentioned in the Declaration of Independence that this tyrannical government is restricting what you can do. Here you can see the proclamation line. Anything past this yellow line was going to be off limits to white settlers, and everything in this other shade of blue here in the middle was supposed to kind of just be the reserves of Native Americans. They could have their lands there, and the white settlers would have their lands along the eastern seaboard. So all that really did was heighten tensions between the white settlers that wanted new land and indigenous groups trying to defend their own. A lot of white settlers just did not care about the Proclamation of 1763. There weren't very many enforcement mechanisms for that, so a lot of them did it anyway. Pontiac's War did kind of highlight that race was an issue here between white settlers and Native Americans. And that is going to be it for this lecture. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you get something out of it. And as always, if you have any questions, go ahead and message me. All right. Thanks, guys.